Today in Roach Reflections I want to talk about shotting patterns for trotting floats. About 2 weeks ago I went for a walk along the river at Wimborne a couple of days after I'd been fishing on the same stretch. When I'd fished there'd only been a couple of other anglers, but when I went back 2 days later there were about 10 or a dozen anglers altogether, and I saw about 5 or 6 of those actually fishing because they were on my bank. And it was interesting to see the different shotting patterns that different people chose. I've sort of settled on a particular shotting pattern over many years, and that shotting pattern sort of came about by accident. Around about 1984 the river was fishing quite well for roach. I hadn't really discovered Avon floats, and I drew in a match just above the bypass bridge. And I started fishing with a float exactly like this, a good sized, I think it's 6 number 4 John Dean stick float with a plastic stem. And I wasn't fishing very far out, about 1.5 rod lengths. I can't remember if I was fishing maggots or bread punch. But it was clear that the conditions were very good, the colour was excellent. There was only about one person drawn in the Roach Bay. Nearly everyone else was above me, all the way up to Canford Bridge, which Wimborne had the first field below Canford Bridge as well back then. But it was clear this float wasn't big enough, and what I needed was a bigger float. And because the float rubbers that go on this float, which I think is a now defunct float, a Drennan balanced balsa as it's known, it's 6BB. The other float I was shotting using lead shot in those days, and it's 6 number 4, which would have been about 5 number 4 and a number 6. And one of the number 4s would have been underneath the float, and then 4 number 4 spread out, number 6 on the hook length. To get the right shotting with this float, what I did was I left the number 6 on the hook length. I think I went on to a number 14. I was probably fishing bread already. It's a very long time ago. We're talking 1984. And I bunched about 3BB. I bunched the number 4s immediately above the hook length, and then about a foot above that I bunched the rest of the shot that needed to get this 6BB float to work properly. Quite a sensitive float, shotted right down. Nowadays I'd probably fish a much heavier float, but I thought that was fine at the time. The flow was right. And so I ended up with this shotting pattern of a single dropper shot, a mini bulk just above the hook length, and then a foot above that another bulk, I could say about 3 BBs. And there was a 7BB version of this around at the same time, and sometimes I would do that with 4 BBs. And that worked really well. I won the match surprisingly easily. Had about something like 11 roach, up to 114, a couple of dace, all on bread, several roach over £1, and around about 12 pounds overall. And the second weight, incredibly, was just £3, and whoever was drawn in the bay made a mess of it. I don't know what went wrong for them, but it proved an easy win. And the swims upstream were they just had low weights of a few dace, up to, like I say, up to about £3, a couple of pounds, pound or so. That shotting pattern stuck with me for a long time, and around about 4 years later started to fish with Avons. This is one of the Stan Bennett floats, 7+ BB, and I started to make my own as well. One's a bit bigger, 8, 9, 10 BB. Very good floats, very sensitive. And by 1988 we'd gone on to lead-free stuff. The early shot that way weren't that good, but there was a thing called tungsten tubing, which I've still got a little bit of, and I started cutting up pieces of tungsten tubing that would take about 6B, equivalent of 6BB, with a number 8 at either end, and again this little mini bulk, and then a couple of number 8s bunched together. Whereas before, back in the early 80s, I'd use a lead 6 or a lead 4. I found that bunching 2 number 8s was as close an equivalent as could be, and I prefer that to having the non-toxic tin shot of a 6 or a 4. So what I've ended up with is a rig a bit like this. So we've got the float, in this case I've moved right down. It's got a great big olivette with 2 or 3 shot either side of it. In this case it's 6 grams, and then we've got this mini bulk about 9 or 10 inches away, and then if it will come untangled, and I've got the hook length just below the mini bulk, around about 9 inches to a drop shot. In this case I'll just put a number 6, but it would be 2 number 8s. And then I've got a bit of artificial sweet corn here to represent what would be the hook and the bait. So you've got that around about 20 inches, 22 inches. So the whole thing from the big weight right down to the hook length is bigger than the screen. If we go right back, it's about close on 3 foot. And what that means is that I can drag, if the riverbed is fairly clean, I can drag a lot of line on the bottom. I can drag close on 2 foot on the bottom without even that mini bulk being on the bottom. And my observation from the other day watching other people fish, one angler was just using, if we move that big olivette down to the hook length, it's now done a job for me, it's tangled up. It was basically that. So you've got an olivette and the bait only about 10 inches from the bulk, and that guy was catching fish, he was using maggots, but it's a very stable rig, but there's very little to actually, there's no dropper shots, and you can't drag very much line on the bottom. You only drag sort of 5 or 6 inches. Interestingly, the guy was from Blandford, and many years ago, I'm talking 40 years ago, started to fish at Knutford just above Blandford. And I noticed the guys from Blandford in those days used this sort of rig, except in those days they weren't using olivettes, they were using a bunch of about 6 or 7 BBs all together with a balsa float, and then a fairly short hook length of about 10 inches, maybe a foot at the most. That was it, no drop shot at all, very positive. They did catch roach. Whether it was the best rig, I don't know, but one of the things with rigs is we do tend to stick with a rig, and that's the rig we think always works. So great thing about these things, we can move them around, so we can have a longer tail, we can move the mini bulk further up, we can move the mini bulk to the bulk, we can have the whole lot 3 foot away. Like I said, it's done a wonderful tangle now. That's untangled. Another angler was the angler who was fishing with the bulk and the hook about 8 inches or 9 inches away from the bulk. He was using what you'd call a bolognese style float. In other words, a big pole float taking about 3.5 grams or so. Another angler was using what I call a very big stick with a thick bulbous top, and then he had much smaller olivettes than this strung out, gradually tapering in size, which is an interesting rig. How well it works, whether it works well, I don't know. I do like olivettes. They do tend to not pick up the flow, so you can get away with less weight. He had about 4 of these olivettes, and I don't know what size they would have been, possibly sort of 2, 1.5, 1, half, something like that, which gives us again about 5 grams. So it's something to think about whether the shotting pattern you're using for the sizable trotting float is very different to fishing a stick float with a strung out shot. What variation works best for you? Like I say, I've settled on a certain pattern. I like this pattern. I think it's the best for me. It's certainly sensitive, and I certainly catch roach on it, plenty of roach on it. So I hope I've got you thinking a bit. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.